Hey YouTube, an inexperienced mechanic here. One of the few things you're going to be having to do when you own a motorcycle is routinely inspect, change, and adjust your drive chain. Over time, as you're riding, if you're off-road or on the street, those linkets can begin to wear and stretch out, which gives you slack. It's important for a chain to have some slack, but not too much slack or too little slack. Make sure you refer to your owner's manual. That'll give you most of the information about maintenance and when to check and how to check your chain, because bikes vary from bike to bike, and the way you check, adjust, and the amount of slack that you have varies. The chain on my 1980 Honda CM400T is a little slacky. Once I did get it, I did adjust the chain to make sure I could ride with it. Rode for about 40 miles or so. Once I got back home, I noticed I still had some slack, so we're going to be making that adjustment again, making sure it's as close to spec as Honda wants it to be. The system for adjusting the chain on this bike may be similar, it could be exact, it could be completely different than the one on yours. The idea is the same though, so if you can take something from this video, that's a win-win. Let's see if we can learn something together. Okay, the first thing you're going to want to do is find your chain. I found mine. I'll wait for you to find yours. So, depending on how your motorcycle's set up, you might be able to easily access it. My motorcycle in particular has a chain cover at the top. I can still access and get a feel for the chain. I'm going to be working with the chain down here since I have more room to put a ruler and get my measurement for this particular chain. And it's important to know your bike. So the more you do this, the more you inspect your chain, you will know how much slack you should have just by feel. So Honda actually specifies 20 millimeters or 3/4 of an inch. You don't need to be good at math to know that that is way more than 3/4 of an inch. But let's find out where we are exactly. The tape measure worked very well. This is a very thin, flexible tape measure. So this will let me fish it in there and get, for the most part, an accurate reading. So let's get in there and see what we're at. So when we're taking our measurement, we want to be sure that we are measuring from the bottom point of the chain slack. So pushing down on the chain, starting our measurement here, and then stopping at the top of the slack. So we're going to get our measuring tape here. Try to be as accurate as you can, but at the same time, the measuring tape, in my case, is going to float a little bit, so I'll try to hold it still. And just find out where you're going to put your starting point. So let's see here. I'm going to use the bottom of the chain, since we're holding it there. Let's see if I can get this to hold. All right, we're going to pull down, and then pull all the way up. And we're about 1.5 inches of slack, and Honda calls for 3/4 of an inch, so we are way over. Now that you get your measurement, you know where we need to make an adjustment. We're on the other side of the bike now, and the way that we make the adjustment to the chain, the way we get slack off of the chain and get it to spec, is by pulling or pushing, depending on how much slack we have, the rear wheel. In my case, and maybe in your case if you have too much slack, we need to pull this wheel back a little bit to tighten up on that chain and give us less slack. And the way we do that is by dealing with this axle nut and this adjustment here on the right side, and also this adjustment on the left side. So let's get a little close up here as to what we're doing. Here we have our axle nut, got a cotter pin for safety, our adjuster, little markings here, and of course our axle running through the wheel and locking itself on the other side with another adjuster as well. The wheel and the axle has this big space to move back and forth, and we limit that movement with this little adjuster here on both sides. What we have to do in this case, since this chain is a little worn and we have to take slack off of it, we've got to take this cotter pin out, this axle nut off, back off this adjuster here, back off the adjuster on the other side, and then we can freely move the wheel and get as close as we can to that spec, and then nip everything back up there. The very important thing we have to look at, though, is because we've got these markings on this right side and the left side, we need to be sure that whatever we do on the right side, we do on the left side. Pretty close together, so we don't want to adjust this exactly where we need to be and then go on the left side and adjust it there. It's gradual, pulling it back equally, because this is messing with a couple things. This is messing with the chain slack, also with the alignment. We have to be sure that the marker over here is exactly the same as it is on the other side, or our wheel will be crooked. Our chain will be crooked and will cause more wear to the chain, to the sprocket, and the rear wheel, and it becomes an issue when you're driving. So let's go ahead and take care of this cotter pin here. I've already gotten it straightened up. Usually they're going to be bent outwards. Just get some pliers and straighten that up. And I might be able to just, oh nice, wiggle that out. And you should never reuse a cotter pin. So since I'm going to be reusing mine, I'm going to tell you not to try this at home. The next thing we need, in my case, 22mm socket, not sponsored by Husky, and a breaker bar. Pretty big bar to break this axle nut off. We're going to position our 22 on there, in my case, and just go the other way so we can loosen it. All right, we're pretty loose in that case. And we're just going to back that out. We don't have to remove it at all, so we're just going to keep it there so we can keep track of it. Let's move on to these adjusters now. So what we have to do in this scenario is hold the adjuster in place and break off this locking nut. Back that out a little bit. We're just going to back it out so I can freely move this wheel back and forth. And even though it's the same operation on the left side, I'd still like to show you how I'm doing it, because if I make a mistake, I want you to learn from it. So let's go ahead and loosen that one. And these things are not on there that tight, but we're still going to be using the 2 wrenches to hold in that nut and that bolt. All right, we've got both sides pretty loose. What I want to make sure before I start pulling the wheel back using this adjuster bolt is, you see how this moves up and down? I want to make sure that I'm positive that the left side, the position of this adjuster, is in the same position as that side. What I mean by that is this metal bracket that moves, because as it moves, my marking moves as well with it, even though the wheel is not moving. So I need to make sure that whatever position this is in, that marker stays there, and whatever position this is in, it matches the position on the other side. So I'm going to just get as close as I can to make sure it's centered, so that when we start turning this adjuster in and it starts pulling the wheel back, we can make sure that on both sides it's the same. As we turn this and tighten it, it's gradual, and of course we'll do this. I'm doing this just to show you what it does. As we turn this, you can begin to see over here the chain is starting to straighten up, tighten up a bit, and this marker is moving backwards. So right now we're on the 3rd point. So there's 1, 2, 3. I'm lined up right on the 3rd point, and our chain is got some slack. So let's do it on the right side as well. Let's work this. It's moving. We're gonna move it to that 3rd point right there. So we're aligned there. One thing that I did forget to mention about checking the adjustment of the chain is making sure that when you check the measurements, you're not too close to either sprocket. You're going to want to be in the middle of the 2 sprockets. So if you check the slack here, of course, the chain being closest to the sprocket, it's going to have more tension than right in the middle. We want to make sure we're rotating the tire and setting our measuring tape back up here and finding if we have any loose or tight spots. What I mean by that is that some parts of the chain may be tighter, so like right here, it is extremely tight, so we may have to bring this tire up just a little bit more. This may be our tightest spot on the chain, because if we go on a loose spot and we make the adjustment here, well, when the tire reaches this very tight spot, we've over tightened that, and now we've got not enough slack, and we're going to cause damage to the sprocket and the chain. So we might want to find that tightest spot, which for me might be right here actually. Barely any free play there. So we're going to want to make that adjustment there. So in the middle of the 2 sprockets, just going to line up this measuring tape. At the bottom here, we're going to push down just lightly here. Not going to force it all the way down as far as it can go. We're just going to lightly push down and push up. Push down and up. That's a little bit tight, just a little bit. So we're going to back off the 2 adjusters just a little bit, get that as close as we can, 3/4 of an inch, and then we'll be good to go. same thing on the other side as well. Alright, so I've got my measuring tape again in the middle. After a little bit more fine tuning and lightly pushing down, there's our starting point right at the bottom of this. Link it, and to the top, that's about 3/4 of an inch. Now one thing to keep in mind is that if I turn the wheel somewhere else, I've got a lot more slack here. And that gives me an indication that it may be coming time to remove the chain, replace the chain. Once we've got our measurements in place, pretty much just the opposite of what we did. On the left side, go ahead and just make sure we're holding that in place. We're going to tighten this locking nut, making sure that this doesn't change as we're riding along. So right side is the same. We're just going to go here and snug that bolt in. And we're going to come through and get our axle nut snug as well, just for a moment, and then we're going to check. I'm going to check the measurements one more time just to make sure I'm good, and then once I know we're good, we'll torque this down to what it's supposed to be. Anytime you're working with your car or your motorcycle, and for example, if you're messing with the axle nuts, it's important to make sure those are torqued down to the spec to make sure they don't loosen up, making sure we're not over tightening it and damaging the threads or the part that we're actually replacing. So the manual calls for a torque rating between 58 foot-pounds and 72 foot-pounds. So let's go ahead and tighten this down. There we go, 60 foot-pounds. Back in we go. Never reuse your cotter pins. Never reuse your cotter pins. We're gonna bend that a bit. If you got to the end of the video and you were successfully able to adjust your chain without my help or with my help, pat yourself on the back. Get your keys, take it out for a spin, and enjoy it. A couple things to keep in mind that I've learned from this, and I hope you've learned from this as well. Making sure that when you check the slack, you're in between of the small and the large sprocket, or between the two sprockets. That way you get an accurate reading. Take multiple readings, just make sure you're correct. Make sure you're also looking for the tightest point of the chains, or the least amount of slack on the chain. On an older bike like mine, or if you have a vintage bike as well, you might find that some parts of the chain are looser, some parts may be tighter. So look for that tightest spot and make that adjustment there. Make your measurements there as well. It took me a while to get a torque wrench, especially for doing work on my cars. Anything from lug nuts to replacing the head gasket and retightening the head bolts. I will use this. Since we mess with the axle nut here, I highly recommend having a torque wrench so you can spec that. You can tighten that bolt right back to where it was supposed to be. I'll leave a link in the description below of where you can buy this torque wrench. I've had it for a couple of months. I whip it out when I need to. I put it back away when I'm done with it, and it hasn't let me down yet.